Hey everyone, and welcome to another video. So this is going to be similar to the last one, but we did try to extend this a little bit and give you a couple of different angles, so I really hope that you enjoy it. This piece is going to be inspired by the view out of our house. Now, out the back of our house is a nice big grass field, and it's rented out to some local cattle farmers. And so I have this wonderful view all summer of a grassy field with trees and adorable cows. And of course there are some calves as well. And they're so cute. My dogs love it. We love it. It's a fun time. So I'm starting off with a linen warp string, and I did decide to weave this upside down because I had this sky yarn from just a little bit of extra from some yarn I made last year that I sold, so I didn't get a chance to use any of it, but I had just enough, I think, that I would be able to create the sky of this piece with this yarn. So I left the amount of warp string I needed to wrap around the dowel I'm using with the cardstock there, and then I'm weaving this yarn in over 2 under 2. And normally I like to needle felt the skies, but because I knew I was going to be doing so much needle felting on the foreground of this piece, I wanted to use this yarn to create the sky instead and see how I felt about it and see what it would be like. This yarn is the same type of yarn that I have a few spinning videos of. You can check those out on the channel. And it's basically, I use my drum carder and I card together different colors of wool. In this case, it was the natural color and a couple of different blues. And then I core spin it with a worsted weight yarn as the core. And then I spiral ply it with a thin cotton string. The green yarn is the same situation. I made a similar piece to this one last summer, and I was a little bit nervous about this yarn, but you'll see what I end up doing with the grassy part of this to make it a little bit more interesting, because this grass yarn, there's not a lot of contrast in, which, while it's true to what it looks like in real life, is not as interesting to me translated onto a piece like this. So right now I'm figuring out how to leave, well, I'm just basically making sure I leave enough at the bottom of my piece that I can still add the fringe and the structure stitches at the bottom of the piece. I clean off my table before I flip over my loom because there tends to be a lot of wool dust on the table after I've done the weaving part. And then I'm tucking in the ends. I like to do this before I start needle felting, because if I don't, though it's going to be so needle felted in the green part of this piece especially, that I wouldn't be able to tuck in the ends properly after the fact. So I like to do that first. Plus it means one less finishing step to do when I'm done all the needle felting. And the needle felting of this piece took me so long. Even though it's a small piece, it took a really long time, and I had to do this over, I think, 3 separate days. I've been really struggling with some neck and shoulder pain, and needle felting unfortunately aggravates it, which is very frustrating. And it's such a repetitive task that it can really be hard on your body. And I do prefer doing this flat on the table than having it upright, because I find if I have to fully hold my arm up, my shoulder gets even more sore. And I've been trying so hard to focus on using just my hand and my wrist to do the needle felting, but it seems like inevitably I still tense up my shoulder a bit, and I'm so not able to use both of my hands for needle felting. I only use my right hand. It's like drawing for me, so I feel completely uncoordinated trying to do this with my left hand. Anyway, according to my physiotherapist, I should be taking many more breaks and stretching a lot more. So by the 3rd day, I did actually do that, and I stopped every 20 minutes to get up and stretch and move around. So maybe that's a good tip for you if you're doing something similar, to make sure that you are not staying in that same position for too long, because it can make you sore. So I'm starting the needle felting off with some trees. And again, this is inspired by my view. We have more poplar trees than evergreen or like spruce or pine trees in the view that I have, but I wanted to do evergreen trees instead. I thought it would be a little bit easier to create the tree line this way. And so I started off with a darker wool, and then I do a lot of layering on top of them. And every time I do this, I feel like I'm still learning how to do it great and better. And the smaller the scale, the harder this is. I also find, because it's harder to get any sort of detail. I do want to make a correction to myself as well, that I keep saying that my favorite art is abstract landscapes, but they are not abstract. They are impressionist. And I'm very sorry to my college art history teacher that I apparently forgot the difference between those two things. So it's definitely impressionism that I really, really love. So I'm not trying to create hyper realistic art ever, especially with wool. That would be quite challenging and not really a challenge that I want to take on. I love impressionism. I think it looks, I don't know, I think it lends itself really well to wool, because wool by nature is quite fuzzy. And so that more impressionist look, where it's, you can see what the shapes are, but they're not photorealistic, this works really well with wool. So I used a few different colors of green to start creating the trees, and then I added some things on top of it, and then I moved on because I was feeling a little bit frustrated with the trees. So I moved on to the cows, and I will 100% tell you that I looked at several different paintings that had these more impressionist cows in them to try to get a handle on how to do it, because I'm still very much feeling like my brain is in the process of learning how to look at something in real life and create it in a more impressionist way. And it is surprisingly challenging. And I don't know if it's sort of the perfectionist in me, I assume, that I want to keep adding detail and make it look more like the real thing, even though I don't need to, and I know it will look good if I don't do that. But there's just something about it where I'm like, but should I add an eye? And it's like, no, you shouldn't, because that's gonna look crazy on this particular piece. So I did it. I'm taking process photos. I love to text some of my family and friends the in-process photos of my pieces to hopefully get a vote of confidence, especially if I'm feeling really like, is this gonna look at all good? I'm feeling kind of insecure about it. I love to send photos to be like, look what I'm making. And usually it's like, oh, that's looking great. And I mean, maybe my friends and family are just also really nice to me, but I do think it just helps to have some fresh eyes on your pieces. And sometimes I'll straight up ask, does this look weird? And most of the time, it doesn't look too weird. I've just been staring at it too long. So this is another vote for taking your time with pieces and letting yourself do them over multiple days, because even though everything in me just wants to finish a thing, I know that I often need to walk away from a piece and come back another day and have those fresh eyes on it, because it is amazing how much that can do for you in terms of being like, oh, actually, now that I'm looking at this again, I think it looks good. Sometimes you're looking at very specific details for way too long, and things, it's kind of like if you say the same word like fork over and over and over again, it starts to sound like it's not a real word. It's kind of the same with this, I find, where you just need to walk away and come back and see that everything's fine. I really like the cows on this piece, and I forced myself to not spend excessive amounts of time on them because of my experience making the last piece that was similar to this one, where I spent at least 2 hours on a single cow, and it still didn't quite look right to me in the end. I am adding lots of shadowing and trying to create a little bit more contrast on the ground of this piece, since this yarn does not really have a lot of variation in the color. The variation is so subtle that I felt I needed to add in the contrast with needle felting. So I kind of went with the concept of having these areas where there's darker spots on the ground, which, you know, makes a lot of sense. And then I started adding in these little flowers. There's a lot of clover in the field, and often there's dandelions. At least in my backyard, there are a ton of dandelions, and it just kind of is what it is. So I decided to try to add in some of that as well, because I felt like adding some actual color, green is a color, but adding some other colors in would add interest and depth to this piece that it didn't yet have. I'm adding more areas of darker green as well to sort of create a sense of the field isn't perfectly flat. Now in real life, the field is perfectly flat, pretty much, but I wanted to add in those details to make it more interesting. And that's where sort of the inspiration becomes a little bit more loose. It's a starting point. It's not necessarily exactly where I want to end up. I still want this to look more whimsical than real life and more magical even than real life is. I added a ton of flowers. I ended up taking a lot of them out because I felt the way that I had spread them out was almost too even. But I worked more on the tree line, adding lots of different layers. I do like to jump around in my pieces, because if I do start to feel that there's a section where I'm getting frustrated, I try to work on a different section of the piece so that, again, when I go back to the area I was frustrated with, I hopefully have fresh eyes on it. And that's something that I still struggle with. I do kind of just want to push through, but it doesn't always work that way. I've really been thinking a lot about creating my art without having to explain every decision that I make while I'm making it. I probably mentioned this in the last video, but there's something that feels really good about it, because the reality is I don't really weave outside of videos, because every time I go to weave, I think I should obviously just be filming this. So this type of video is sort of a nice in-between for me, where it's my own art practice, but I'm also still making a video out of it, and I can sort of summarize my thoughts afterward. What you're seeing now is me adding a house or a shed, whatever you want to interpret it as. This is something common. Now, there isn't one in the real image, if you will, that I can see out my windows, but it is a common thing that you'll see in a lot of pastures. There might be an old shed or an old barn or even an old house in a lot of fields. And so I decided to add this in because, one, I love little houses, but also because I was really feeling like there needed to be something that was decidedly contrasted from everything else, because the brown of the cows and the green of the grass are not very contrasted, and there wasn't really a good way to make them really contrasted. So I thought if I added the focal point of this little house or little shed, whatever you want to think that it is, I thought that that would really add a better focal point, and I think it did just that. I love it. And there is, again, something whimsical about a little house. And I didn't want to make it too overly detailed. I did try to add a chimney in it, as you saw a couple minutes ago, but it was moving in toward the trees too much, and so it felt like it didn't quite look right because the color of the chimney was looking too close to the trees that were behind it, so I decided just to leave it out. But I feel like this is bringing it together more, but of course, when I'm looking at it now, I'm like, I think I could have just added the house and a few more flowers and it could have been done. But of course, instead, I'm adding a path as well to create additional contrast and some depth to it as well. Paths are really hard, I find, the perspective of them. And while I do look at references, I also try to make myself just create it on my own a lot of the time as well, and to really look at it and think, what do I think it needs? What shadows and highlights should I add? And try to make my brain work for it a little bit without solely looking at a reference, because the reality is most of the references I will look at are photos or paintings, but I'm creating in wool. So there is still a certain amount of difference in those two things, in that I can't just outright copy a path, nor do I want to. So while I'll look at several references, and a lot of the references I looked at, the pathways were quite light, to me on this piece that didn't quite look right. So I decided to do it a little bit darker. But then I did fall into the trap of being like, maybe it should be lighter, which is what I'm doing now. And sometimes you just have to try a lot of different things in order to get to the thing that looks right. I don't know if a lot of other creatives and artists talk about this, but for me personally, a lot of my process seems to be problem solving when I'm creating artwork. And I feel like maybe it's just my perception, but what I see a lot more of is people, I feel like whenever I'm watching someone else make art, it feels like they just like get in the zone and they're really in their feelings to create work. And then meanwhile, I'm sitting here I see it as problem solving, and maybe that's just the way that my brain is wired, is it's more just, I don't know. Making art feels a lot like moving through life, where you're just like, oh, this isn't quite right. How do I fix that? What can I do to change that? And like trying to problem solve my way through it. And it seems to work for me, and I'm okay with that. And I think that's something I had to realize a long time ago, that like my work isn't really meant to be super symbolic. It isn't to evoke specific emotions necessarily. I think my goal always is to make things that I find really beautiful, and it's just as simple as that. I love when these pieces, by the end of it, I just wish I could go into them and I could visit that place, and there's something really magical for me in that. And that's my whole drive to create things, is just I really want to make beautiful things. I spent more time on the path, and I was kind of debating between whether the pathway should be really defined or if it should be a little bit more organic. And I think I fell somewhere in the middle, where I'm trying to create a look where the grass is almost growing over the path, but I'm still also wanting the path to look fairly defined, because if it gets too fuzzy or whatever, or maybe abstract is the right word here, then to me it was starting to look a bit too messy that way. So I kept messing around with it. And this whole piece, I think, took about 7.5 hours, which is a really, really long time. But it also just is what it is. It's so much slower than I assume painting would be. Now, I've never done oil painting, but I assume something like acrylic painting would be a lot faster. But with needle felting, every little bit of wool you're putting on there, you have to like sit and needle felt for quite a while. So it takes a long time. I'm moving on to the finishing parts of this piece. So I took a super bulky yarn, I did a twining stitch, 2 rows of plain weave, and now I'm adding the fringe on top of that. Because I was doing so much needle felting on the bottom half of this piece, that's why I decided not to add the fringe right away, because I felt like there was a high likelihood that there would end up being a lot of wool lint and wool dust that would get onto the fringe. And so I wanted to avoid that completely, and that worked out well. And I will say though, without the fringe there, the piece felt a little bit unfinished to me. Now, not every piece needs fringe, but when you add those finishing touches, like the fringe, like the dowel, or maybe you're framing your piece, or maybe you're doing a different type of stitch at the bottom and tucking away those warp strings, it starts to all come together in a way that you don't get when it's just still sitting there on the loom looking a little bit unfinished. I decided to knot all those warp strings, which I always do at the bottom, and I did tuck them in. There are cases where I will just cut the warp strings about a 1/2 inch from the knots that I create instead of actually sewing them back into the piece, but that is pretty much only if I'm using 8/8 cotton, which is thicker, and I'm doing a double warp, because basically at that point it becomes so thick that it's quite difficult to sew it back into the piece. But whenever I can, I do like to sew these ends back in because it does make the back of the piece look a little bit more tidy, a little bit more professional. And while it is just the back, people really love to look at the back of pieces, which I find so interesting. So now I'm using a lark's head knot to attach this to my dowel. I stained the dowel quite dark. I thought it was gonna be a little bit lighter, but it was looking kind of blotchy, so I just darkened it a bit and that helped. So I'm adding the hanging string. We're almost done this piece and you're about to see it in its full glory. It's all done, so let's have a look at the finished piece. Let me know what you think of this piece, and if you enjoyed this video, check out this one next.